The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Right Side. Doug Billings here with you today. Today on the program, how movements are engineered, how law becomes optional, and how power learns to silence without ever passing a law, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to break down the moral architecture of a free nation. Not just what holds a republic together, but why this matters. And what happens when pressure replaces persuasion. Ladies and gentlemen, The Right Side with Doug Billings is now upon you. Are you ready? Let's go.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hey everybody, my name is General Mike Flynn, and I'm here to do a big shout out for my great friend and one of the best in the business, Mr. Doug Billings. Right Side with Doug Billings, Right Side with Doug Billings. Doug is the future of the airwaves when it comes to independent broadcasters and podcasters. He is the new Rush Limbaugh. He's exactly what America needs right now, looking for honesty, looking for wisdom, looking for truth, looking for patriotism. Listen to Doug Billings at Right Side with Doug Billings. God bless you and God bless America, and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are winning. We're winning, winning, winning. Welcome to The Right Side with Doug Billings. Are you ready?
We are not liberal snowflakes who melt away in the face of tragedy, adversity, and challenge. We are a covenant nation under God, and His divine providence is not dead and it's not gone. It is living within each and every one of you. And you will bring it to life in such a way that the world has never seen before. We never back down. We never give up. We march forward.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hi there. Welcome to The Right Side. Happy to have you with us. Please remember, subscribe to this program on YouTube. At The Right Side, Doug Billings. At The Right Side, Doug Billings. Free to subscribe. Click on the red bell so that you get notified when we drop new content. And follow me on X and Facebook. All of the social media platforms, Truth Social, etc. And we're in this thing together. And today, kind of want to talk about AstroTurf versus the grassroots in American power. How power learns to imitate the people. The loudest battles in politics are the ones that you see on television. The most important ones are the ones you don't see at all, ladies and gentlemen, because they don't happen in the streets. They happen in boardrooms, donor meetings, activist training sessions, and digital war rooms, truly, where narratives are designed and funding is allocated to these people, and movements are built much like a marketing campaign. And that's where I want to start today. Not with protests, not with President Trump, not even with Minneapolis, but with something much more fundamental to whether a republic survives or collapses. The difference between a grassroots movement and an AstroTurf movement. Let's define terms, because this is where most people get played and they get taken advantage of, where the media plays on emotion rather than on intellectual maturity. A grassroots movement grows from the bottom up. It comes from neighbors, churches, families, workers, parents, veterans, small business owners, pastors, rabbis, those who start talking to each other before anybody else is really paying attention. And it spreads slowly, news within the grassroots movement. The grassroots movement itself spreads very slowly. And it's not always clean. It's sometimes messy, but that's okay. It's organic. It doesn't have a logo package. It doesn't have something like a marketing plan on day one. It has conviction before it has coordination. Now compare that to what we're increasingly seeing across the country, these AstroTurf movements, as I call them. They don't grow, they're launched. They don't emerge, they're scheduled. Really, they don't organize themselves. They're not organic. They're funded, trained, transported, and promoted. And today, Minneapolis is being set up as the next flagship of a stage for what's being branded as the so-called No Kings March. So think about that phrase for a moment. No kings. No kings, ladies and gentlemen. In the country that literally rejected monarchy in 1776, in the nation whose entire political system is built on the idea that no man rules another by birthright or bloodline, we don't have kings here. We have laws, ladies and gentlemen. We have a constitution. We have limits on power. So when you hear slogans like that, the No Kings March, the question isn't what they say. The question is what they're trying to replace. And that's where I want to take you back to something most people have never read, but everyone lives under. The beautiful collection of the Federalist Papers. And if you've never read these things, I encourage you, I beg you, I implore you, read the Federalist Papers. Specifically, James Madison. Madison didn't fear disagreement. He didn't fear protest. He didn't fear loud people in the streets. He feared factions. And here's what a faction is in plain English. A faction is a group that stops seeing the country as a shared home and starts seeing it as a territory to be captured. It's the moment when persuasion gets replaced by pressure, when debate gets replaced by disruption, and when citizens get replaced by assets. That's the real danger of professional protest. Because when a movement becomes an industry, it stops being about truth and it starts being all about leverage. And folks, let's be honest about that. This might be uncomfortable. Real grass movements don't need bus routes. They don't need talking point packets. They don't need legal defense funds. They don't need bailout funds from Kamala Harris and the radical left. They don't need any of that before the first sign is even printed. They don't need corporate media coordination. They don't need public relations calendars. They have something far more powerful than that. They have belief. Belief makes people show up, and they show up on their own time. Belief makes people own their own money, own their own words. And I'm not saying that every person who shows up to these events is paid, but I am saying this. When you see the same cities, the same tactics, the same slogans, the same legal support structure, and the same media that frames all of this identically and continues to appear over and over and over again, you're not watching a spontaneous civic awakening. You're watching a system at work. And here's the part that they don't teach in school anymore. The First Amendment protects your right to speech and to speak. It doesn't guarantee your right to control the country by disruption. The founders believed in protest, most certainly. They believed in something also that was much more than protest. They believed that there must be consent of the governed. Not consent of the loudest, not consent of the most aggressive, not consent of whoever can shut down the most streets. Because once a society starts rewarding disruption instead of articulate persuasion, it doesn't get more free, it gets more fragile. And that's what the radical liberal and progressive movement want. Why do they need stagecraft? Why do they need branding campaigns? Why do they need national rollouts? Why do they need media choreography? Strong ideas spread through conversation. Weak ideas spread through pressure. And that's the difference between a republic and a mob. A republic argues its way forward. Absolutely so. A mob pushes its way forward. And that's why we see in Minneapolis, it's not just about one march or one weekend or one headline. It's about something much, much bigger than that. It's about whether this country still believes that citizens persuade, or are we going down a path where fractions will compel us? Because when pressure fails, ladies and gentlemen, when persuasion fails, when disruption becomes the tool and when law becomes optional, that's when you start seeing what comes next. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about what happens when the dissent stops being dissent and starts becoming disorder. Very important distinctions in a republic. Dissent versus disorder. Why law is the last line of compassion. And the radical left don't see it, well, they do see it. See, the radical left aren't stupid. They know this. They want to convince you otherwise. Once a society decides that disruption is a form of virtue, it doesn't take long before disorder becomes a form of power. And this is where we have to draw a line that our culture is trying very hard to blur. There's a difference, a civilized difference between dissent and disorder. Dissent is protected. Dissent is American. But disorder? I would even argue that dissent is woven into the DNA of this country. Disorder is what happens when nobody is protected anymore. That's disorder. And this week, once again, Minneapolis became a case study in what that line looks like in the real world. A group of agitators attempted to interfere with federal law enforcement. You are all well aware of the background of the story, specifically ICE agents. And what followed was not a protest. It was thrown objects. It was physical confrontation. It was arrests. Now, here's the part that you don't hear much about on television. This doesn't expose injustice. It exposed records. Because when law enforcement processed the people who were arrested, what came out wasn't a list of first-time concerned citizens from the grassroots. It was rap sheets, long ones, repeat ones, violent ones. And I want you to think about this, not emotionally, but historically. Throughout history, the people who suffer the most when the law collapses are not the powerful. They're not the politicians. They're not the activists with media platforms and legal teams. They are single mothers, elderly neighbors, small business owners, working families, immigrant communities, legal immigrant communities, and the poor. Law is not a weapon of the strong. Law is supposed to be the shield of the weak. Every civilization that has ever collapsed, ladies and gentlemen, follows the same pattern. First, rules become optional. Then enforcement becomes political. Then violence becomes selective. And by the time people realize what they've lost, there's no referee left to appeal to. So let's talk about ICE for a moment, not as a political symbol, but as a concept. ICE is not a hashtag, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a talking point. It is a federal law enforcement organization. Highly trained, highly educated people. You can disagree with immigration policy. You can campaign to change it. You can vote to rewrite it. That's how a republic works. But when you decide that enforcement itself is illegitimate, you're no longer arguing about policy. You're arguing about whether law applies at all. And that's not a political debate. That's a civilizational discussion. Because here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. If you can physically block federal law today, who gets to physically block your rights tomorrow? Rights only exist, ladies and gentlemen, if someone is willing to defend them for everyone. Not just for the people they agree with, not just for the people they like, not just for the people who vote the way that they do. That's why the founders didn't build a country on feelings. They built it on process. Courts, legislatures, constitution, due process. because they knew something about human nature that social media seems to have forgotten about. Power always thinks that it's righteous. Every mob believes that it's on the right side of history. Now look at what happens when that line disappears. You don't get justice, that's for darn sure. You get tribalism, my friends. You don't get equality, you get favoritism. And you don't get peace, you get permanent conflict. And folks, this isn't about left or right, all right? This is about whether we still believe in a society where disputes are settled by laws instead of your fists, where arguments that we have are settled by ballots instead of barricades. Because when the law becomes the enemy, when enforcement becomes something to sabotage, and when officers stop being human beings in the eyes of the citizenry and they start being targets, that's when something even darker enters into the picture. And I'm going to talk about what happens when politics overrides ethics, when professions meant to protect life, safety, and human dignity start flirting with the idea that harm is justified as long as it's aimed at the right people. That's a very, very dark place. When politics tries to rewrite our moral code. And I think there's a certain group of people out there that would like that very much. There's a moment in every society when the argument stops being about policy and it starts being about people. Not what they believe and not who they vote for, but whether they still count as human beings. And that's the line that should stop all of us in our tracks to consider. This week, a nurse, a medical professional, was fired after publicly suggesting that people should drug ICE agents. To drug ICE agents in order to sabotage their work. Let that sink in, ladies and gentlemen. A person whose entire profession is built around healing, protection, and care, flirting with the idea of paralyzing another human being because of a political cause. This isn't a story about immigration. It isn't even a story about law enforcement. That's a story about what happens when ideology tries to replace ethics. And it's a story about possession by evil. And there is plenty of that going around today. We are in a spiritual battle like we've never seen before. For most of human history, certain professions were treated morally bound. Okay? Doctors, nurses, clergy, judges. I'd throw teachers in there. They weren't just trained in skills, they were trained in limits. Even when they were afraid, even when they thought that they were right, because the moment that a healer decides who deserves to be harmed, society loses its last moral firewall. Now, think about this without politics involved just for a second. Imagine walking into a hospital and imagine sitting in a courtroom. Imagine stepping into a church and wondering quietly in the back of your head, does this person see me as a patient or a problem? Does this person see me as a citizen or as an enemy? Does this person see me as human or as a symbol of humanity? That's what collapses trust in a society. Not disagreement, ladies and gentlemen, dehumanization. And there's a pattern that shows up in every dark chapter of human history. First, people get labeled, then they get mocked, then they get excluded, and then they get targeted. The words change. The uniforms change. The slogan changes. But the pattern doesn't. Nobody ever starts by saying, I want to hurt innocent people. They start by saying, these people don't count the same as we do. And once that door opens, it never closes easy. It's the difference between moral systems and political systems. Politics asks, what helps my side win? Morality asks, what's right, even if my side loses? A society can survive bad policies. It can't survive the collapse of its moral limits. Not at all. And here's the part that should concern every parent, every teacher, every pastor, every doctor, every citizen. When young people are taught that intent matters more than action, that if your cause is good, quote unquote, your methods are automatically justified. Well, when that happens, you do not get activism, ladies and gentlemen. You get permission. Permission to harass, permission to sabotage, permission to harm. And folks, you don't build a better country by teaching people where the lines are. You build a worse one by teaching them there are no lines at all. So now we've talked about how movements get engineered instead of grown, how dissent turns into disorder, how ideology tries to override ethics, which brings me to the final question in this segment of the program. If politics can't save a society, if power can't hold a civilization together, what can? And I want to tell you about something that happened at a dinner in Iowa the other day. It didn't make policy. It didn't change a law. It didn't move a poll one way or the other. But it said something quietly powerful about what kind of country this still is and what kind of country it could still be. Faith, humility, and the quiet strength of a free people. After everything we've talked about today, engineered movements, disorder in the streets, ethics becoming ideology, becoming at risk, I want to take a different track here. Not to a rally, not to a protest, not to a press conference, but I want to take us to a diner. This week in Iowa, President Trump stopped at a local restaurant to greet people before he gave a speech at a rally. Okay, no podium, no teleprompter, no cameras carefully framed, except for the ones from the Will Cain show where they were interviewing the president. A series of tables, there was the counter, coffee cups, regular Americans enjoying a meal and watching and listening to the president. One man did something that almost never makes headlines anymore. He asked a very simple question of the president. Can I pray for you? Now think about how strange that sounds in modern politics. Not, can I take a selfie with you? Can I make a statement? Can I challenge you? But can I pray for you? That moment didn't come from a campaign, and it didn't come from a party line. It didn't come from a talking point. It came from something older than all of that. Belief. Now, whether you're religious or not, you should understand something deeply American about that moment. The founders didn't just talk about freedom. They talked about where freedom comes from. They believed, and they wrote, that rights didn't come from presidents. They didn't come from courts. They didn't come from Congress. They came from God. That's not a theological argument. That's a political safeguard. Because if your rights come from governments, then governments can obviously take them away. But if your rights come from something higher than power, then power has limits. That is the moral foundation of a free society. Now look at the contrast. On the one side, you have movements built around pressure, disruption, and leverage. On the other side, you have a man in a diner offering a prayer. One is about control, the other is about humility. And here's something that the modern world struggles to understand. Faith doesn't make people perfect. It makes them restrained in a lot of ways. It reminds them that they're not gods. It reminds them they are not the final authority. It reminds them that every person, even the one with whom they disagree, answers to the same moral law. That is what conservatism was always meant to be. Not a party, not a brand, but a posture towards human nature. The understanding that people are capable of great good, and by the way, great harm, and that freedom only survives when it's paired with conscience. Because a society that believes in nothing higher than itself eventually believes in nothing but power. And I'm going to say this clearly. Prayer doesn't solve immigration policy. Prayer doesn't write legislation. Prayer doesn't balance budgets. But prayer does something else. It reminds people that the person across from them is not just an opponent, not just a voter, not just a symbol, but a living human being filled with the holy dignity of God. And that single idea, that simple idea, is what holds a republic together. When everything else is trying to pull it apart, that will pull it together. That's why I say we meet, you and I, here on the right side in determined prayer, because it's people like us, pockets of people like us throughout the United States and throughout the world that keep this from spinning off into complete and utter chaos. So as we move into the second half of the show today, I'm going to stop talking about movements and moments. I want to talk about institutions and systems, because the next question isn't just, well, what do people believe? It's, what do our schools, our media, our courts, and our churches teach people to become? That's what I want to talk about. I mean, legitimacy, right? How institutions shape what a nation believes is normal. Because, in the first half of this show so far, we've covered movements, mobs, ethics, and faith. But there is something much more powerful to discuss. Something that you don't chant at, something that you don't march against, something that you don't even really notice until it's already changed. Institutions. Because the truth is, most people never get told this. Revolution didn't win the streets. Revolution wins in classrooms and newsrooms. Revolution wins in courtrooms and in boardrooms. Very clearly so. And the reason they win is simple. The institution will decide what feels normal. That's what institutions are geared to do. Not what's legal, not what's moral, not what's constitutional, but what feels normal. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Every society runs in two ways, on two systems at the same time. The first one is law, okay? That's your constitution, your courts, your statutes, your elections. So that's formal structure around law. The second system is far more powerful. legitimacy. That's what people believe is reasonable, acceptable, and just the way things are. Okay? Laws can change a country slowly. Legitimacy can change it overnight. Because when people stop believing a rule is legitimate, they don't just try to change it, they start ignoring it. That's why you have laws on the books that technically exist, but practically don't, because enforcement collapses when belief collapses. Now let's tie that back into what we've been talking about. When you see movements that don't just argue policy, but argue that enforcement itself is immoral, they're not trying to win a vote, ladies and gentlemen. They're trying to erase legitimacy. That's a different kind of battle, and it doesn't get fought on Election Day. That battle gets fought in teacher training programs, journalism schools, HR departments, corporate policies, legal theory seminars, and the like. Because if you can shape what the next generation believes is normal, well, then you don't need to pass laws. The culture will enforce your worldview for you. And every major transformation in history followed this pattern. First, a belief is introduced as radical. Then it becomes controversial. Then it becomes acceptable. Then it becomes expected. And then finally, it becomes enforced. And by the time it's enforced, most people don't even remember it was controversial. Good grief. That's how power hides inside of quote-unquote progress. Sound familiar? So let's talk about media for a moment. Not as an enemy, but as an institution, okay? The media doesn't just report what happens, folks. It teaches what matters. It teaches the people what matters. It teaches them what to do, what to be afraid of, what to be angry about, and what to ignore. And over time, that creates a moral map in people's minds. Notice something subtle there. When a protest aligns with a certain narrative, it's framed as activism. When it doesn't, it's framed as a threat. Same actions, different moral labels. That's not an accident, ladies and gentlemen. That's legitimacy shaping. And here's another thing institutions control. I bet you've never thought of it. Memory. Not what happened, what gets remembered, what gets taught, what gets archived, what gets framed as a lesson for the future. A country that loses control of its memory eventually loses control of its direction, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's bring it all closer to home. When schools stop teaching civics and start teaching activism, students don't learn how a republic works. They learn how to pressure a republic. And when journalism stops asking, is this true? And starts asking, well, who does this help? News becomes strategy instead of information. And when courts stop asking, well, what does the law say? And it starts asking, what should society become? Justice turns into policy by robe. Activist judges. And when all three happen at once, the system stops being neutral. Think about this. Now, let me be clear. Institutions are not evil. They are necessary. They can't have a country without them. We cannot have the United States without institutions. But institutions have a weakness. They tend to protect themselves before they protect the people that they serve. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just human nature. Every organization eventually starts measuring success not by, are we serving our mission? How are we living up to our mission statement, Doug? But by, are we preserving our position? And that's when legitimacy shifts from being earned to being asserted. This is where conservatism at its best plays a unique role for us, folks. Not as a break, not as a change necessarily, but as a question. The conservative question is simple, and it's also relentless. What are we risking by changing this? Because every institution carries more than policies, ladies and gentlemen. It carries tradition, safeguards, hard-earned lessons that are written in human cost, terms of human cost, right? Those hard lessons that we've learned. Not everything old is wise, okay? But not everything new is harmless. So let's connect this back to what you are seeing in the streets. When people stop trusting institutions, they don't become more patient. They become more radical. And when institutions stop listening, people stop persuading. They start pressuring. And that's how you get a feedback loop. Distrust creates disruption. Disruption justifies control, and control deepens distrust. And around that loop goes. We also need to talk about how this plays out inside one of the most powerful institutions in American life, the workplace, where you go to work, corporate power, HR power. I used to be the vice president of human resources in the automotive industry, manufacturing, and healthcare, aerospace. I can tell you there is power in the workplace. Corporate, HR, professional speech, economic pressure as a form of social control. Because in the modern world, you don't always get punished by the government, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes you get punished by your paycheck. Soft power, that's what that is. How careers and corporations and culture become political leverage is what I want to talk about. When most people think about power, they think about government, quite frankly. They think about laws, police, courts, elections. But in the modern world, some of the most effective power doesn't come from Washington. It comes from the workforce and workplaces throughout the country. Because you can disagree with a politician and still go to work the next day, right? But when you disagree with your employer's culture, your livelihood is suddenly part of the conversation. That's what political philosophers call soft power. And it doesn't tell you what you must believe. It tells you what you're allowed to say. And over time, that distinction changes how people think, not just how they speak, how they think. Hard power can make people obey, okay? Soft power makes people agree or pretend to agree. You connect that to something that we talked about earlier. We discussed the nurse who lost her job after making a public statement about harming federal agents. I'm not bringing that up again to relitigate the case, not at all. I'm bringing it up because it shows you something deeper about how institutions enforce norms. Every workplace has two rule books. The one that you sign when you're hired and the one that you learn by watching what happens to other people. That second rule book is way, way more powerful because you learn what opinions get applause, what opinions get silence, which opinions get you a meeting in the HR office. And pretty soon, people stop asking, is this true? And they start asking, Is this safe? That's not how free societies think, ladies and gentlemen. That's how managed societies think. A managed society doesn't need to ban ideas. It just needs to make them expensive. When speaking costs you your career, silence starts to look like wisdom all of a sudden. Now, you talk about corporations for a moment. I want to do that, not as villains, but as institutions with enormous cultural reach. Corporations shape what products get made, what messages get marketed, what values get promoted in advertising and training and branding. They don't just sell things, they sell norms. And there's something that most people don't think about. Big corporations don't like instability. They like predictability. They like environments where they can plan, they can invest, and operate without any kind of disruption. So when social pressure and political movements start creating volatility, corporations don't ask, well, who's right here? They ask, what reduces the risk? And very often, the fastest way to reduce risk is to align with the loudest cultural force. Not because it's correct, but because it's costly to resist it. Power doesn't always pick sides, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes it picks the path of least resistance. You bring this down to the level of the individual, to you and me. Imagine that you're a teacher. I was once upon a time. Imagine that you're a nurse, an engineer, a manager, a truck driver, okay, whatever. And you start to feel that certain opinions, certain questions, certain beliefs are no longer just disagreed with, they're documented, screenshotted, reported, forwarded, logged. That changes how people behave. Not because they've changed their minds, but because they've changed their calculations. And when people start self-censoring at scale, public opinion stops reflecting private belief. Let me say that again. When people start self-censoring at scale, public opinion stops reflecting private belief. And that's when polls get weird. That's when elections shock people. That's when institutions say, well, we had no idea this was coming. Because silence doesn't mean agreement. It often means caution. And so I want to be clear about something. Every workplace has the right to set standards of behavior. No one has the right to harass, to threaten, or to harm other people. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the space between conduct and conviction. There's a difference between saying, don't treat people badly, and saying, don't think the wrong things. You see that? A healthy society polices actions. An unhealthy society starts policing thoughts. Now, here's where this connects to economics in a country where healthcare and housing and education are expensive. Losing your job isn't just inconvenient, it is existential, which means economic pressure becomes a form of social control. You don't have to pass a law to change behavior. You just have to make the alternative unaffordable. All right, now let's zoom out again, because when corporations align with cultural movements and media celebrates that alignment and schools teach the values behind the movement, you get another feedback loop. Culture reinforces power. Power reinforces culture, and dissent gets squeezed in the middle. Not banned, not arrested, just isolated. And throughout history, that's how conformity usually spreads, not through force, through incentives, through rewards and penalties, through who gets promoted and who gets passed over. The most effective pressure is the kind that doesn't look like pressure at all. And we connect this back to the core message and the core question of today's show. What kind of country are we trying to be? A country where people are free to speak, to argue, and to persuade, or a country where people learn to navigate instead of believing? Because there's a difference between being polite and being afraid, my friends. One builds community. The other one builds compliance. And you got to talk about the space where all of this eventually shows up. Not in the streets, not in the workplace, but in the ballot box. How legitimacy, that soft power that we spoke about, and cultural pressure shape elections long before a vote is cast. How people don't just choose candidates, they choose between belonging and standing alone. And we have elections coming up this year. Belonging versus conviction, when elections become cultural referendums. Most people think that elections are about policies, taxes, borders, healthcare, schools, foreign policy. And those things do matter, but if you watch closely, you'll realize and notice something deeper that's happening just below the surface. Elections are becoming less about what people believe and more about where they belong. Because in a healthy republic, voting is an expression of our conviction. We weigh ideas, we argue with neighbors, you disagree with friends, and then you make a choice. But in a fractured culture, voting becomes a signal. It becomes a badge. It becomes a declaration of tribal identity. Conviction says, this is what I think is right. Belonging says, this is who I am. And when politics becomes identity, compromises stop being a virtue, and they start feeling like betrayal. And that's when the temperature starts to rise. Not because the issues changed, but because the stakes did. And I can connect this to everything that we've been talking about today. That institutional and cultural loop that I've been talking about. When institutions shape what feels normal, and when workplaces shape what feels safe, when media shapes what feels acceptable, by the time people walk into a voting booth, they're not just carrying opinions, they're carrying social consequences. They're carrying the memory of which conversation went quiet, which jokes didn't land, which posts got unfriended, which questions got labeled. So the ballot becomes more than a piece of paper. It becomes a moment where people ask themselves something very, very human. Am I choosing my beliefs or am I choosing my relationships? That's not new. Every society that becomes deeply polarized goes through the same phase. Public life turns into a loyalty test. Not what do you think, but whose side are you on? And once that happens, the political system stops being a marketplace of ideas and start becoming a map of tribes. Democracy depends on disagreement. Tribalism depends on division. Now, you talk about something subtle but very powerful. Human beings are wired for belonging. We don't like being isolated. We don't like being excluded. We don't like being the only one in the room who thinks differently. That instinct kept our ancestors alive, but in a modern political culture, it can be exploited. Because if you can make people feel that certain beliefs come with a social cost, you don't have to convince them that they're wrong. You just have to convince them that they're alone. Loneliness is one of the most powerful political tools that there is. Now think about how this shows up during election season. You start seeing language, right? Like everyone knows, or most people agree, no reasonable person would think, fill in the blanks. Those phrases don't argue ideas. They draw boundaries. They tell you this is the inside of the circle and that's the outside. Where do you want to be? And when people feel pushed outside the circle, some get louder, some get angrier, but most of them get quieter. They don't stop debating. They stop believing. They stop posting. They stop asking questions. And then eventually, yes, they do stop to debate. Not because they've been persuaded by anything, but because they've been outnumbered socially. Silence is not consensus. It's oftentimes self-preservation. And I have a great deal of empathy for people who feel that way. But here's a danger of all of that for a republic. Seriously, a system built on votes assumes something much deeper exists underneath. And that's something that's very important and that's assumed is mutual respect. The idea that even when you lose, you still belong. But when belonging becomes conditional, when acceptance depends on agreement, elections will then stop being peaceful transfers of power, and they will start feeling like existential battles. Does that ring a bell in today's world with you? And that's when people stop trusting outcomes, not because they lost, but because they feel excluded from the country itself. So this is where the conservative instinct that we have matters, not as a party line, but as a stabilizing force. It asks questions, conservatism does, like what traditions hold us together when we disagree? What rules make losing tolerable? And what institutions make winning humble? Because a republic doesn't survive on victories alone. It survives on losers who still believe that they belong. The real test of a free society isn't how it treats the majority. It's how it treats the minority, especially when the minority is wrong or loud or unpopular. And we can bring that back to something very simple, something very human. Think about your own life, my friends. Think about your family, your friends, your coworkers, your church community, your neighborhood. Ask yourself, do we still argue and then break bread together? Do we still disagree and then shake hands? Do we still debate and then show up for each other when life gets hard? Because that's where democracy actually lives. Not in Washington, D.C. It lives in living rooms throughout this country, on front porches and backyards. I want to talk about how a country finds its way back from all of this, not through laws and not through elections, but something much slower, civic repair. How trust gets rebuilt, how institutions earn legitimacy again, and how neighbors become neighbors instead of opponents. Civic repair. How free societies heal without forcing agreement from anybody. I wish that every school in America taught civics again. If institutions shape legitimacy, if cultures shape belonging, and if pressure can shape behavior, then the real question becomes this: how does a free society fix itself without becoming something else in that process? Because history gives us two very different answers. Some societies will try to heal themselves through force. They pass more rules, they tighten speech, they censor authority, they censor speech, they silence dissent for the greater good, they will say. And what they usually get is quiet. They don't get peace. They get quiet. Other societies try something much harder, much more difficult. They try to heal through trust. Trust is slow. Trust is inefficient. Trust is uncomfortable. But trust does something that force never can. It lets people change their mind without losing their dignity. No one grows up in a cage here. They grow up in a community. You get my drift. Now let's talk about what civic repair actually looks like. Not in theory, but in practice, okay? It doesn't start with a bill that's passed or debated on the floor in Congress. Local schools teaching civics instead of slogans. That's what we need. Churches and community groups creating spaces for conversation instead of applause lines, right? And local media asking hard questions instead of picking teams. Families that model disagreement without contempt. Now, that's not glamorous. That doesn't trend. It's not going to go viral. But that's how countries stay countries. Remember what we said earlier. Institutions don't just enforce rules. They teach habits. So the question becomes, what habits are we teaching the next generation? Are we teaching them how to debate without dehumanizing each other, to lose without withdrawing, to win without humiliating someone else? Or are we teaching them how to label instead of listen, pressure instead of persuade, or cancel instead of convince? I really believe that the future of this country is being trained right now. It's not being voted on. And let me say something that doesn't fit neatly into any kind of a political box. A republic does not survive because everybody agrees. It survives because everybody agrees on how to disagree. That's the real social contract that we have in America. Not who wins, but how we treat each other when someone does. The founders didn't believe that America would stay free because Americans were perfect or somehow wired different in our DNA and our bones, right? They believed that it would stay free because Americans would be responsible. Responsible enough to control their anger, to question their own certainty, to respect the humanity of their opponent, right? Liberty is not the absence of limits, ladies and gentlemen. Liberty is the presence of self-restraint. Now let's bring this back down to something personal for us. Ask yourself tonight, when I talk about politics, do I leave people feeling understood or concerned? Do I leave space for someone to say, I never thought about it in that way? Or do I leave them looking for the exit? Because every conversation you have is a small act of nation building. The Republic doesn't just live in Washington, it lives in break rooms, dinner tables, church foyers, barbershops, ball fields, neighborhoods, families. That's where the country either fractures or it mends. And here's the part that doesn't get said enough. You don't have to surrender your beliefs to live in peace. You just have to refuse to surrender your humanity. Conviction without compassion becomes cruelty. Compassion without conviction becomes confusion. This country has survived civil wars, depressions, world wars, assassinations, riots, and revolutions of culture. Not because it always gets things right, it doesn't, but because over and over again, enough ordinary people choose something extraordinary. They choose to stay in the room, to keep talking, to keep listening, to keep voting, to keep believing the person across from them was still their neighbor. That is not weakness. That's the quiet strength of a republic. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to my YouTube channel, please, at The Right Side, Doug Billings. Follow me on X, at Doug Billings, on every other social media. We are out there. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in this thing together. I can't stress that enough. And let's meet, as we always do, in determined prayer and determined patriotism. We're in this together, ladies and gentlemen. Believe it. For the Republic. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the set of my show, Doug Billings. Hey, my good friends at EMP Shield, that's electromagnetic pulse, in case you're from Raytown, Missouri. Electromagnetic pulse could wipe out your home electrical system, could wipe out your vehicle. And thanks to the radical liberal agenda that was put forth under Administrator Biden and Vice Pretender Harris, there are lots of people in this country who want to do us harm. And maybe an EMP device would be their chosen weapon. But EMP Shield gives you a device that can protect you. This little baby here goes on your home outlets, a computer, a router, whatever you want to protect. And then they also have a larger model like this. You can still hold it in the palm of your hand that goes on your vehicle battery so that you can get out of trouble from point A to point B. EMPshield.com. Promo code Doug, ladies and gentlemen. Save yourself. Save your property. EMPshield.com. Promo code Doug. We're in this together, folks. Believe it. For the Republic. Cheers.
The Right Side with Doug Billings.